Come forward when you're ready. Thanks, guys. I now welcome Professor Peter Koopmen, Emeritus Professor at the University of Queensland. Good morning and thank you for being here. As you may have heard previously, I've asked people to be careful about the use of unparliamentary language. It normally occurs when a witness is quoting another individual rather than themselves being unparliamentary. And also, if you could, I don't know if you're going to do this, Professor, but if you're going to identify any individuals who may not wish to be identified, if you could just, in a public place, if you could be just conscious of that. You've been here for a short time, so you've seen the process. A 5-minute opening statement, after which the committee members will have some questions for you.
All right, thank you.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everybody.
Sorry. I've got to ask you to state your full name and title for the benefit of Hansard, please.
All right. I'm Peter Koopmen. I'm an Emeritus Professor at the University of Queensland. Feel free to call me Peter, as you will. I have been with the University of Queensland for over 30 years now. As an academic, but the views that I'm about to express and my opinions are my own and not necessarily those of the University of Queensland. Let me say at the outset that I have no problem personally or professionally with the concept of gender self-identification. I personally believe, and I think there are a lot of people in this room that would agree with me, that people do have a right to control their own destiny, that they have a right to a bright future, they have a right to live as they want to live, free of discrimination, prejudice, and so on. So that's not a problem for me. I believe that people should be able to live their lives as they will. You will perhaps have read my submission. It's a very focused submission, and it centres around my professional expertise, which is that for the bulk of my research career of over 40 years, I've been concerned with the biology of sex. And so I feel that I'm well qualified to talk to the committee about the specific difference between sex and gender. Now, I know that this is well appreciated amongst the committee, but I can't stress enough that sex and gender are very, very different concepts, and that it doesn't help anybody to try to conflate those two concepts and pretend that they're the same thing, because they're not. Sex has a very specific scientific and biological meaning that is essentially fixed. It's a fundamental description of a person's state that's as fundamental as describing your species as being Homo sapiens, a human being. It's not something that you can alter. Now, obviously, it's recognised that there is more than just two sexes. Some people are of indeterminate sex. That's a separate category. That's well recognised. But sex is a fundamental biological descriptor of an organism, of a person, as fundamental as their species, as fundamental as their height, their eye colour, their age, or what have you. Gender is something entirely different. It's a psychosocial construct. It's a much more fluid construct. It's open to self-identification. We all do that to some extent in the way that we dress, the way that we behave, our body language, our voice modulation, the things that we do in society are very much reflections of our individual identification as men or women or boys or girls or whatever that may be. There is no problem, in my view, with gender fluidity, with people being agender or choosing how they want to identify themselves. That's all fine. But a person's gender, how they choose to behave, to identify, to relate, isn't the same as their sex. And their sex is a fundamental biological thing that's essentially fixed. So the key question in my mind is how to enshrine in law a person's right to identify with whatever gender they may feel that they are. And I think it's very important to understand that a birth certificate is entirely the wrong instrument for a person to express their identity. We rely on birth certificates for the most crazy things that are not fit for purpose of a birth certificate. A birth certificate is a historical record which is very important in a number of different research, academic and scientific spheres to be relied upon as a snapshot of what that person was at the specific time of the point of their birth. It seems very clear that there's a requirement for a different form of validation for people to register their chosen gender. Now, I don't know why there is opposition to having a separate type of validation document. I, for example, am required to show a driver's licence to show that I can drive. It's not on my birth certificate. For some academic purposes, I'm required to show a certificate that indicates that I have a PhD. That's not on my birth certificate either. Now, if we could just get around the idea that a birth certificate is a catch-all document of validation of how the person is at any point in time, I think we'll have advanced the cause quite significantly. So essentially my problems with the bill are that firstly it's too rushed, it's a much more complex area than can be settled in the short period of consultation that's been given. I don't think that the negative consequences have been thought through properly. But most importantly, I think here we have a great opportunity for Queensland to show some clarity, some leadership, some understanding of separating fact from desire. We should be able to create an enlightened document, a correct document, and a document by which everybody wins. There's not some winners and some losers. Thank you very much. So really the point of my being here is to share my expertise, if that's possible, in the biology of sex for the benefit of the committee. So please ask me any questions you may have.
Yep. Thank you, Peter. Laura?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Peter. Oh, Professor, but I'll call you Peter if that's okay. It occurs, and this might not be a question you can answer, it might be more of a question for DJAG, but what is the point of recording sex on a birth certificate?
I don't know. What do you put on a birth certificate? I mean, I think in terms of a record, a human record, you know, we keep records of humanity in some way, who is born, who dies, who has, you know, been on this planet, who they were. We keep all sorts of records, and these are very important for research, philanthropy, it's not philanthropy, anthropology, genealogy, science, genetics, law, all sorts of, you know, fields of human endeavour rely on records of who passed through this planet, where they came from and so on. You could ask the question of what information is useful to have on a birth certificate. You know, the fact that a baby was born, I think, is the most fundamental thing. But what else about that baby? What was their name? You know, that's fraught because people change their names as life progresses. But in principle, it should be possible to record the name of the name an infant was given at the time of their birth as a starting point for a list of some information that could possibly go on the birth certificate. Other useful things may include their height or weight, what do you put on a birth certificate? I don't know the answer to that. But gender isn't one of those things. It's not something that a baby has yet.
Yeah, but you can't tell me why you would put sex on a birth certificate either.
Oh, look, not really. It's somewhat arbitrary. I mean, humans do some strange things. You have to ask why we have separate toilets. I don't know the answer to that either.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sandy?
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Professor. I just want to go back to you spoke of an enlightened document. As you would have heard maybe earlier in the hearing, that we have brought up about a gender identification certificate versus a birth certificate that's accepted. One of the points brought up was that, it discriminates by saying those that have when they're doing self-identification, that having that document, again, is discriminatory. But if it was to apply to everyone and we re-looked at the birth certificate as a birth record, which could be held confidential, do you believe that addresses what you have raised regarding sex and gender and the two differences?
Oh, absolutely, I do. Again, you have to ask the question of why is the question being asked what sex I am or what gender I am. There are certain circumstances that under which gender may be a relevant question to ask. There may be certain circumstances under which what sex you are may be a relevant question to ask. There are some things in society where it does seem to be based on sex. You know, let's say a gynecology clinic is founded on what reproductive organs you have. It's not whether you believe that you are, a man or a woman for the purposes of gender identity. Are you with me?
Yeah.
There are other situations where what you have in your underpants is of no consequence to the question. A trivial example might be a women's only book club or something. I mean, that's a quick example off the top of my head. It's of no consequence what sex you are really in that circumstance. It's whether you are able to empathise and embrace the concepts of womanliness in a sufficient way or in an appropriate way for that organisation.
Jonty? And this will be the last question.
Pressure's on. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Peter. Peter, in your opening statement, you mentioned, I didn't capture the sentiment, but you mentioned that we needed to redo the legislation so that there aren't winners and losers. Who are the losers in this legislation?
Oh, look, there are 360 submissions that there's probably, up to half of them that articulate disadvantage or, negative unforeseen consequences arising from legislation or from the bill as it's currently written. It's not really my job to...
But in your view, it was your statement. In your view, what did you mean by that statement?
Well, one of the things that comes up time and time again is the concept of women's rights and hard-fought rights for women who, in the apparent eyes of the writers, need to satisfy certain criteria to be women, and that those are not necessarily quite as arbitrary as the bill, I think, perhaps makes out in places.
So in your view, women are the losers?
I'm sorry?
So your view is that women are the losers under this bill?
That would be putting words into my mouth. That's not it at all. I think the volume and nature of the opposition that's embodied in the many submissions that I've seen indicates that some people feel that there would be winners and losers from this legislation. I think we can do better than that.
Understood. Okay, thank you.
Jason, can you take yourself off mute to see if we can hear you? Okay. We still can't hear you, mate. Thank you. Yeah, just wait. This question is from Jason. Some submissions have suggested that the gender is a rigid and immutable biological construct. Is this a historic or biological supported idea?
I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly, but gender isn't a rigid biological construct at all. In fact, it's not a biological construct. It's how you feel you are, what you feel you are, how you feel you as part of society, and you know that is fluid. Some people don't feel any gender. Some people feel aspects of both genders. They're perfectly entitled to those feelings. I don't really think that's in question, but that's not biologically immutable. That's you know, a psychosocial construct that's under the control of the individual.
Now, I did say last question. I'm sure you heard it.
I'll be fast. Professor Koopmen, in other areas of debate in society, there's often a call to accept the science of a matter. Does this bill accept the science regarding sex and gender?
Oh, no. Look, conflating sex and gender, the key problem from my professional point of view is that the bill is flawed because it tries to conflate sex and gender, put them all in the same lump. They're not. They're totally separate concepts, and it's convenient for some purposes to put them together. I mean, we as a society have a hopeless track record in understanding and keeping separate the concepts of sex and gender, because sex is a word that people have tended not to want to use. So we've adopted gender as a euphemism for sex. It's the word you use if you don't want to say sex. But that's made us go backwards, because now people think that gender is sex when it's not. They're separate, and you know it's perfectly possible, and I don't see why it needs to be unacceptable for people to have a sex that's incongruent with their gender identification, their gender outlook, their gender bearing.
Just out of interest, Professor, how many births per 100,000 are indeterminate or intersex?
Intersex, I think it's about 1 in 25,000.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. That brings